We should be completely clear. What we're talking about with the Taiga is an analog synthesizer. I mean, there's no doubt about this. This is an analog synthesizer. Pittsburgh Modular makes great analog synthesizers, and this is one. Yes, it has a huge amount of digital functionality. Yes, I'm controlling it with a MIDI keyboard. These things are digital aspects that exist within this analog synthesizer. Now, there are so many analog synthesizers that exist on the market right now that have an analog signal path. And so everyone's like, okay, this is analog. It has an analog signal path, an analog filter. We're done. It's analog. But let's be honest about a variety of factors. There are many ways that digital inclusions among an analog signal path can really interfere with the natural analog sound that you might be looking for, although many these days don't really know what the benefit to analog is. And let me be very clear, analog sound is flawed sound. It is flawed sound that makes a synthesizer sound more like an acoustic instrument. And I know a lot of people are like, what are you talking about right now? But the fact of the matter is, when we all went crazy and decided we would rather play vintage synths than modern synths because we missed the analog sound, the thing we were talking about was character. And the character came not from, clever programming, but rather the flaws that were extant in the various circuits that existed in vintage synthesizers like the Mini Moog and the ARP 2600 and a variety of others. It was their inability to be perfect that gave them a character. And we thought, oh, these are imperfect. Let's, improve pitch and improve, amplitude, and let's remove all the distortion, and let's, and what did we end up with? 80s digital synths, which sounded cold, sterile, unnatural. Not to say that's a bad thing. I mean, that's actually pretty cool. We all love a really robotic, sterile, clean digital sound. That's awesome. But some of us really want that particular weirdly organic analog sound. And many, maybe even most, of the analog synthesizers today are not giving that to us. They're just saying, hey, this is analog and it sounds great. Therefore, you're getting an analog synth that you want. But sounding great is not the definition of analog, which is what underlies all these ridiculous arguments about which is better, digital or analog. It's not that analog is better than digital. It's that certain things are better for certain applications. And really vintage analog has this really cool sort of organic, squishy sound that is not robotic or even necessarily futuristic like so many people wish it was. What is cool is when you get an analog synthesizer in this day and age that sounds like a vintage analog synthesizer, thereby validating its description as analog. And I guess that giant diatribe I just went through is the point of that is the Taiga is that it has character. It has the variability, you could say the flaws that give it a sound that sounds like vintage synthesizers, which is one of the main reasons I've been very excited about it. Yes, there's a lot of digital functionality. I'm sure people are like, oh, can you show us how to work the, arpeggiator? The fact of the matter is, me trying to explain an arpeggiator to you is not me talking about synthesizers. It's me talking about the programming that someone did for an outcome I don't use. That's why you don't see me doing a lot of the digital stuff anymore, because it's like, you don't need me to vocalize a list of instructions that you can read. It's not how it works that I'm educating you. It is various factors and elements about synthesis or timbre that are important that are not in the instructions. That's what I'm for. So if you're here looking for how do I use the arpeggiator or the shift register on this thing, there's a list of instructions you can find somewhere that I'm not going to read off to you, primarily because it doesn't interest me, and therefore I don't have the enthusiasm to effectively teach it. Anyhow, the point of this is analog, and the Taiga is analog joy. Okay, so just there, we heard a great analog sound, and granted, that can be faked. But the natural tone that this thing has, every time I say, I wish I had an oscilloscope so I could show you what I'm talking about, everyone's like, you should have an oscilloscope. Shame on you for not having an oscilloscope. But again, what we're doing is using our ears. The oscilloscope would only be a visual verification of the fact that this sawtooth is different. There's more to this sawtooth than just a traditional standard sawtooth, which can be created with literally any synthesizer or any software. What makes the sawtooth interesting isn't how much of a sawtooth it is, but in effect, how little of a sawtooth it actually is. So I don't have this thing on an oscilloscope, but it is a great sounding sawtooth. And that's because Pittsburgh Modular has created these insane oscillators that really mess up, the really pure oscillator core with, wave folding and a variety of other things. And so the result is something that sounds good, something that sounds interesting, not a perfect representation of the saw. This is not what we're looking for unless you are a sound designer and you know your tools and you want to use specific tools for specific outcomes, and you absolutely want to start with the perfect sawtooth. This is a musical instrument because it has character. Its saw is different, and that character is important because when you hear that saw and you say, wow, that sounds great and that inspires me to make music or perform music, that's the benefit of using this instrument. If you're sitting and you're doing sound design or something else, you may not want the coloring that exists in something like this. But again, you probably are using completely different tools. That filter, most people do an analog synth and they have the most rigidly in-tune oscillators in the world. And then they throw an analog filter in there that's also really, really smooth. And you don't get an analog sound, but somehow these oscillators are crazy, which is awesome. And then this filter, which is very controlled, still has character, even though it is very controlled, which makes it unique. Because usually you get, on a vintage analog synth, a filter that sounds great, but behaves terribly. Like it's noisy, it's weird, it's unpredictable. The spread across the swing of the knob is variable, but this thing, that is just a rich, gorgeous analog oscillator sound going into a rich, gorgeous analog filter sound. And also, we're only using one oscillator right now. Of course, if we bring in the second oscillator, we can hear that they're out of tune because we get that really cool sort of chorusing effect. That is worth its weight in gold. And of course, you could theoretically throw that in there. Ooh, we still have duophony. A lot of people think analog sound lies in crazy resonance or, stacking oscillators, but no, it's just having oscillators that are messy enough to sound pretty, but controlled enough to control. And the same with the filter. And that's what the Taiga literally has. And we haven't even talked about the insane low pass gate, because if we've just been using the VCA, we can open this filter all the way up and then go into the low pass gate. And then all of a sudden we have this great sound. And it's funny because to me it sounds almost more vintage than it would. Now we also have some bleed there, which is a common situation with low pass gates because of the way that they're designed, but If you want perfection, you don't want analog anyway. And we have this resonance. That is glorious. And no, we don't have to go through a lot of the functionality to talk about analog, because analog is like a core basis thing. It is a foundational thing. It's how the oscillators sound naturally and how the filter filters them naturally. And that's where you're getting analog quality, the tone that you're starting with. And then the other functionality is just dressing on top of that. So just in the little I have played here, you can hear some incredible analog tone that the Taiga has that makes it, if you're like me, a person who wants an analog monosynth to perform live with so that you can do traditional analog monosynth riffs and melodies and whatever, I suggest this over a lot of monosynths that exist on the market right now, primarily because this is way more powerful than they, even though it may be less expensive than they, but primarily because this sounds like vintage analog, in addition to having an insane amount of functionality, which allows you to really, go in and do some full synthesis. Unlike so many monosynths you get out there, a lot of the monosynths are really limited and yet may have vaguely analog sound. This thing is, desirable. If you are a vintage analog lover, I suggest you get this and use it as your monosynth. That's just me. Anyway, this has been my ranting about analog with the very analog sounding Pittsburgh Modular Taiga.